Welcome to this video tutorial on material creation within Rhino. We'll be looking at creating materials within V-Ray, but this can also be applied to any other rendering software you have plugged into Rhino. We'll be looking at creating PBR materials, and PBR stands for physically based rendering of materials, so it's looking at using kind of realistic lighting values and realistic material and texture models to help us simulate real-world materials and effects. Now for this tutorial I've made this simple model here, which is just a simple courtyard. We've got a tree in there, we've got sunlight set up, so we just have a simple directional light, and I've got this background plane here with a texture on just to give us any background reflections to our scene. I've also set up a camera, which is this window view, and what I'll do now is just going to open up the asset editor and open up my render preview, or my interactive renderer within V-Ray, just to show you what the scene currently looks like. And there we go. So you see I've got kind of no materials on here, we've just got a white material on all my objects, and I have this tree based in the middle. For the creation of these textures and materials, we're going to be using a website called CG Textures. And this has a really good library of 3D scanned materials, or PBR materials as we discussed earlier, which you can use, and you can create a free account with these and download a lot of these for free. In another video I'll also be going over how to create these type of materials from scratch from your own photographs, but for now we're just going to be using some of the preset materials to go through the basics from here. You see they've got quite a large library of different material types. And I'm going to start by using this stone brick wall material here. Now you'll see they give you a kind of preview of what the material looks like, and then you also get the material broken down into these different maps. And in this video I'm going to be going over exactly what these maps mean and how they can affect the creation of your material. So what I've done is I've just downloaded each of these down, and you can see here they've got a kind of premium versions and also free versions of the material. Most of the time I find the free version, the resolution is good enough to get away with most renderings. If you want extra large, you might have to apply for a premium account, but for now we're just going to be using the free versions. So before I go into too much detail on these, I've just downloaded them and we're going to go through them one at a time, starting with this Albedo map. So I'm going to go back to Rhino, and what we're going to do is on this back wall here we're going to apply a new material. Now I've got my asset editor open, which was just by clicking on this V symbol here. And if we go to the far left tab, we've got the materials tab there. Now to create a new material from scratch, we're just going to go to the bottom left of that and click on add material. Now for this we're just going to create a generic material. We won't be going into any of these other materials during this session, but I might go into them in more detail in another video. But a generic material can cover you for pretty much most material creation. So we'll click on generic and it will make a new generic 1 material. We can rename that if we want, and I'm just going to name that to wall for my wall material. And what I'm going to do is, let's just zoom in on our model, and I'm just going to right click on the wall and apply it to my selection there. Now if I keep my interactive renderer view on, we can see that update as we go, and you see now it's kind of gone grey there. I'm going to just make sure I'm in my window view. Let's just see how that's affected that view as well. So now we have a grey wall across there, which is fine for now, so let's stop that. So that's great, we've kind of made our new material, but now we want to start making it look like this stone wall that we've got here. Now the first map we're going to input is this Albedo map, and Albedo basically means the colour or the look. It might be called Diffuse in other rendering software as well. You'll see when I click on the wall, and by default you might have this side panel open, so if you select the material and click on this little arrow to the right, it will open up your material options here. We're going to start by looking at the diffuse or the Albedo. It's the same thing, just in there, which means the colour of the object. And with the interactive renderer turned on, you'll see if I just select that grey colour box, it will bring up my colour palette here, and we can kind of scroll around, we can change the colour to pink, and that will update there. So if you just wanted a kind of block colour material, you can create it quite easily just by using that diffuse map and picking your colour there. For this particular material, we actually want to add in a photograph which we're going to be using to help kind of lay out our texture. So to do that, instead of changing the colour here, we're going to click on this little checkerboard box to the right, and this is a map input. Now if I click on that box, it will open up different options for maps I can put in, and because we're going to be using the images we've downloaded from here, we want to put in a bitmap into this, and that bitmap basically means any image file that we're going to be using as a texture. So I select bitmap. I'm then going to locate where I've downloaded those files. You see here I've got them here, and we're going to put in the Albedo for that brick. Just make it a bit larger so you can see. So that's that Albedo file, which is the one I've downloaded from this first map here from cgtextures.com. So open that one up. It will input it in, and you'll see there it's now gone on my wall. Now, depending on how you've mapped your surface, this could come up at a much larger or much smaller scale, and you'll see at the moment it really doesn't look much like the preview. We're still quite far off this final result. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to go back out of here. So we've got that applied to my wall, and I'm going to check the mapping on my wall. Now the texture mapping refers to how big or how small the texture appears on your wall here. It looks like it's quite large. I think I can see kind of bricks there sort of laid out. It looks like it's also kind of flipped the wrong way around. So what we'll do is we're going to select the wall. I'm just going to minimize that here, and we'll minimize down. Select our object, and then we're going to go to the Properties tab and look at the Texture Mapping tab. And we're going to apply a new mapping to this. I usually apply a box mapping for anything kind of geometrical like this. And what box mapping means is it will represent, or kind of draw out a cube, and the cube will represent the size of one square of this image. Sometimes on this website they give you a size that this represents. By default I usually start with 1 meter by 1 meter. It kind of looks about that for this, and then we can kind of scale it from there to get the real world scale of what we need. So we'll go box mapping, and I'm just going to draw out that box. Usually with this you can do it roughly at first, so I'm just going to draw it out roughly. It will give you a preview of the box, and then you just hit enter. Once that's made, you can then, with the object selected and texture mapping selected here, you can look at this XYZ size, and it will tell you in kind of real world values how big that box you just made is. So at the moment it's kind of 2000 by 2000 by 2000. So let's set it to 1500 by 1500. And then I'm just going to select my window again, open back up our V-Ray panels, and let's render that out and have a look and see how the scale's changed there. So there we go, it's looking a lot smaller. It's still quite hard to see, but you can kind of see there the bricks laid out. So that's the kind of first stage. We've applied the colour of our material, and we've set its size. We can go back and change the size later, but I think for now that should be fine. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to go down the list of material properties here, and we're going to have a look at the reflection. Now sometimes objects might not be reflective at all, they might not be shiny, and in this case of the brick, let's go back and have a look at the preview here. You'll see that it is kind of reflecting a slight bit of light there, but it's very subtle. And if I scroll down on the maps, you'll see there isn't actually a map called reflection. There's Albedo, height, normal, roughness, and ambient occlusion. In some of the cases on these objects they might have a reflection map, but in the case of this one we're actually going to be using the roughness map to help with our reflection. Now roughness actually refers to the opposite of reflection. It's actually kind of how rough the object is, how kind of unreflective it is in a way. So we're going to be using this map, but we're going to have to flip it or invert it to help us with the reflection. Now the way a lot of these maps work, especially in the case of the roughness or the height map, which we'll go into in a bit, is that they're black and white maps, and the kind of tone from black to white is representative of a kind of value from 0 to 100%. So in the case of the roughness, anywhere fully white means it's got a roughness value of 100%, and anywhere black will be a roughness value of 0. So it kind of gives properties of the object based upon that scale of 1 to 100 way, and the black and white map can control that. So if we want it to be reflective, I'd probably say it needs to be the opposite of this. So wherever it's white, as you can kind of see here, we don't want it to be reflective. And wherever it's kind of shiny on the very surface of the brick, where it's a bit darker on this map, we do. So I'm actually going to use this map in inverse. And to do that, much like we did with the diffuse, we'll open up the reflection. We're going to, in the reflection color, instead of having a sliding scale, and I'll show you kind of how this works. If we have this on, at the moment it's black, which means it's got a reflection value of 0. If I scroll that up to white, it's now got a reflection value of 100, and you'll see there it's now reflecting that. I've got a kind of background map behind, and we can see it, a square of blue there, being reflected in the material. So that's how that works. Now instead of that, we're going to input our map in there. So same again, click on the map, click on bitmap, and we're going to load in that roughness map. Now at the moment it's kind of as it is, and it's saying that the reflection will be higher in those kind of white areas, and we don't want that. We want the opposite of that to be the case. So to invert it or flip it, we can go to the parameters option, we can go to color manipulation, and we can just click on this invert texture option here. There. And what that does is it will just invert the map, so it will be reflective now on the face of the brick but not in the gaps there, and you can kind of see that working there. And then I'm going to go back to my object. Now the reflection color purely dictates the kind of how reflective an object is. It won't reflect the shininess of the object. That's kind of based on the glossiness value, and you see here the way the kind of reflections are working is they're very sharp, they're very glossy in effect. For my brick I don't want that at all. We want the reflections to be quite muted, and you'll see in this preview there are no kind of sharp reflections on here at all. It's only really kind of picking up subtle bits of light on the corners. So to do that, we could either just play around with this reflection glossiness value. I could slide it down to 0.5, and you'll see there in the preview that it's got a lot less glossy. It's still reflecting slightly, but it's not as sharp. The reflections aren't as kind of visibly sharp like you would have in a mirror. So, or we could also kind of use the same map that we've used for the reflection to control the glossiness. So it will be less glossy in the kind of cracks of the brick and more glossy on the face. And you can do that quite easily just by right-clicking on this map, selecting copy, and just pasting it in the glossiness as well. And you'll see there in the preview that you can kind of see in the cracks of the brick it's not very glossy, but on the face it is. So I think that's kind of working well. It's quite hard to see without the geometry of the brick yet. So the next stage we're going to look at is how to actually add in the geometry or the kind of bump or the texture of that brick material. Now, we've looked at diffuse, we've looked at reflection. We're not going to look at refraction in this because that will control the see-throughness of an object, and in my video on glass I'll go into a bit more how to control the refraction and what that's used for. But in the case of this solid brick, we're not going to be looking at refraction. So we're actually going to skip all of these and we're going to go down to the material options here. That's fine, and then we'll open up the maps options as well. So to control the texture of the object, or the kind of the bump they call it in this case, we're going to be using this bump and normal mapping. Now you'll see in my preview here we have a kind of normal map, and a normal map can be used to sort of simulate the texture of an object. It won't actually change the geometry of that surface, but it can give us a kind of approximation of how that geometry changes. The reason it's colourful and all these kind of different shades of colour is because each colour represents a different angle of the surface. So pink would represent kind of looking to the right, and blue would represent looking to the left, and you can see the way my brick projects, it's going to kind of simulate those different angles in the way that the object is looking when we render it. So on this, let's go on bump on normal mapping. We're going to turn it on, and instead of a bump map, because we have a normal map for this object, we're going to load in the normal map, and we're just going to find, same again, bitmap, and we'll find that normal map for our stone here. You'll see now with that place that we're now starting to get some of that texture of the brick on there. Now the way a normal map works is it doesn't actually change the geometry of this brick. So let's just stop that render and we're going to be looking at it. Let's have a look at it from this angle. From face on it can look quite effective, but when you start to sort of zoom in, and if you're looking at it kind of from an angle, you can see that the actual object is still flat and it's not really kind of changing that actual geometry. The normal map and the bump map, all they do is they give a simulation of the object's texture. So from afar it can look quite effective, but as you get up close it doesn't actually change the geometry. So the kind of reason you'd use this is if you want a kind of texture to look like it's got a bit of surface detail from afar, but if you wanted some close-up detail and actually make it look really realistic, or kind of really like the material you're trying to create from a close distance, you want to use something called a height map instead, or a displacement map. And what the height and displacement do is they actually change the physical kind of geometry of the object you're trying to render. So let's go back to our preview here, and we're going to turn off the bump map in this case, and instead we're going to turn on this displacement map here. Now the displacement map, or the height map it might be called, is used to control the kind of surface of the geometry you're rendering. If we go back to our maps here, you can see we've got this height map here, and the same with the roughness map. How this works is that anything black means that it's not pushed out at all, and anything white is pushed out by a value that you can control. So it has a scale of kind of 0 to 100 in that, and white being the kind of most pushed out face and black being most pushed in. So it deforms the geometry based on that value there. So let's input this map into our scale. Height map, click open, and we'll drop it in. Now by default it's got an amount of 1, and this amount refers to usually the kind of units you're using in your view. So if you're using millimeters as I am, 1 millimeter won't be very noticeable. You can see in my preview we can start to see it working there, but actually in my render we can't really see anything. And this is one of the kind of downsides of V-Ray, is the preview here sometimes doesn't reflect what's actually happening in the renderer, because you might be using a kind of scale of millimeters like I am in this case. So let's put this up to 100 for my amount and hit on enter. You'll see in my preview now that this is going to go mad because it's basically pulling the geometry out by 100 in that scale, which we won't be able to see within the preview. We're just going to stop and we'll start up our render in our render frame again and see how that's affecting the geometry there. Now this is taking a little bit longer to render out now, and the reason for that is displacement takes up quite a lot more processing power than other methods of material creation, and you'll find with the bump and normal it takes a lot less time to render than the displacement does, but the results of the displacement are much more effective, and you can see now that the actual kind of geometry of this object is changing based upon that value. So we're actually getting some geometry changes which are looking quite effective in this option here, and the kind of more you up that amount, the more the geometry would change, and the kind of more strong the effect would be. So you can play around with that sliding scale there as well. So I've also just changed the amount there to 200, and you'll see it's taking a lot longer to render now, but it's looking quite effective, and we're kind of getting that prominent geometry change that we wanted as well. You'll notice when you use displacement, if you kind of have objects overlapping like I do here, because it pushes those faces out, and that's the way it works, you can get weird things where you get kind of objects clipping into one another like I have with this frame here. And that might not be quite the effect you're looking for. So sometimes you need to just make sure that objects are kind of separated out from each other so they don't overlap when they get displaced. And other times you can kind of maybe make objects slightly fatter to avoid that from happening. But that's kind of basic principles of using these materials. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to quickly just drop on a few more different materials so we can see a lot of these in combination. And then that'll kind of finish the video there. But each of them use similar principles. So I'm just going to pause now and we're going to add in a few more materials so we can see these kind of working in combination together. So you see now I've added in a few more textures to the floor. We've got this kind of mosaic tiled floor here. You'll see also on this we can go back if we want to and change some of the parameters. So at the moment I've got a kind of map controlling the glossiness of this floor, and we can see it kind of working there. If I turn that map off, we can just do that by deticking this box. I can just have it fully glossy so we can see now it's perfectly reflecting that tree and that white square above there if we wanted it to be shinier. I've also got a bump map on this floor controlling the slight sort of bump on the tiled texture, and we can turn that off if we want to make it super smooth. So you can always go back and kind of play around and change up these textures if you want to vary them in any way. So yeah, you have that control in there too, and sometimes if the displacement is working a bit too hard, it's causing your render to take a really long time to render out, you might want to turn off the displacement and use a bump map instead to control that value. So for example, if we did that with the stone here, let's say this was taking a bit too long to render out, we could go back to our wall. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that displacement map, but we're going to turn it off and we're going to turn back on the bump and normal. Instead of the normal map, let's just put a bump in there, and we're going to use the same height map that I'm using for my displacement as the bump, and let's see how that changes it. And we'll put it up to a 10, so it's hopefully doing a bit more than it would do. So you see here it's a lot less effective. We've got a very subtle, because it's not changing the geometry at all, the effect is much more subtle on there. We're still getting a slight variation of the height, but it's not as kind of readable as it would be if I have the displacement turned on. So bear that in mind, depending on how close you are to the object, how much of the effect you want to be shown. You can substitute the bump for displacement in a way, but it's quite a different sort of look. So that's it for this video on Introduction to Material Creation, and like I said, you can apply these principles that we went through in this video to the creation of any material in any other rendering software. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on more specific materials like glass, metals, water in other videos, so we can cover that, and also looking at how to create textures from photographs and how to turn those into these maps that we've used today to make these materials. So I'll see you in the next session.